There you go, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Berta. And a hearty greeting to all who have prioritized this meeting today, sharing this space among good colleagues, professionals who are working to identify, investigate, analyze, prosecute, follow up, rehabilitate, and work with survivors of sexual torture. It's a real honor that IRCT has been able to contribute to the extent we could, and so many members have contributed, and not least survivors. I mean, this entire series, webinars, I would like to say has been co-created with survivors. It is a platform they have formed, shared, and I believe the findings in Dr. Alice Edwards' report clearly show the influence and the design and the consequences and also the follow-up ambitions of survivors of sexual torture. I would like to say it's been a pleasure to be able to see that rehabilitation techniques and the specialization required to deal with sexual torture has been really adequately addressed in the report. And I think that's because there have been so many professionals who have contributed in a very productive space, in individual interviews, in online questionnaires, in other webinars, feedback. So it's been a really inclusive space. And I think, Alice, you've had the opportunity to really be able to be saturated with all the vast knowledge there is, leading us to some clear conclusions of ways forward. Number two, I do think, as said, survivors have been co-creating, co-developing, designing the space, the questions, the responses, and also the provocative questions for us moving forward. It's been really impressive to see the outcome of some of the hearings for healing and justice in Colombia and in Nairobi most recently. Among others, some of the outcomes there with survivor networks now formed very succinctly. And yesterday, in fact, a delivery of over 700 signatures from the survivor network out of Latin America to presidents of those countries. Last but not least, and on my most recent visit to Kenya 2 weeks ago, having heard survivors speak to the impact, Alice, it had of you as the highest ranking UN official with a special brief on torture, taking the time, and not 10 minutes, but 2, 3 days time in very difficult spaces to listen patiently, gracefully, and I think in a very dignified way, asking trauma-informed questions in a very respectful setting so that survivors like Jenna from Kenya last week was able to tell me, I really felt that suddenly and finally somebody of a very high level in this United Nations system is listening to me and will take my story seriously. And this helps me on my torture survivor journey, helps me on my journey in life. It helps me as a woman feel connected to other women in the world beyond my small village in Kenya, selling fish at the market. And it helps her as a mom moving forward with her life, as a partner, as a daughter. And all these aspects are so incredibly important as we, as IRCT and the greater global community, work to deal with identifying sexual torture as a crime and as prosecuting it and helping survivors to find their space, their feet again, and their justice and healing in this journey. So we're proud to have been a very small part, but I think the survivors really have the foundation and the pillar here of making this happen. And it will be a fascinating next 30 minutes when Crispin Thorold, who is the communication consultant for Dr. Alice Edwards, will be quizzing Alice in the 30-minute period about her report that's been published. And then participants on the webinar will then have the final half hour, if not a bit longer, to ask your questions. So as far as formats, remember there's interpretation available, 1. Number 2, if you could save your questions to after we have the session when Crispin is posing some provocative questions of Alice in order to unpack the reports. Lastly, remember there will be a recording of this event. So any of you who or your colleagues who missed this phenomenal opportunity to be part of the call will be able to revisit the opportunity, refresh your memory on what's been said, and share wider with other staff members or colleagues or stakeholders who may not have been able to be part of this incredibly important event in order to move us forward with identifying sexual torture and dealing with it as far as the implications. Over to you, Crispin and Alice, and thanks very much for letting us be part of this important journey.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you, Berta, and thank you to you all. I have to say, sitting in my shed in Toronto where I do my work for Alice, it's sometimes really difficult to feel connected to the countries that we're working on, and so it's a real privilege for me personally, but for all of us within Alice's team, that you've all come together today. And Mahmoud, hearing what you were saying about your experiences in Syria, I think a really kind of powerful start to this conversation and a reminder of why we're all doing this work. So let's get underway. My name is Crispin Thorold. I'm a strategic communications advisor to Alice Edwards, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. I think it's been the honor of my career to work for Alice for the last 18 months, and I hope for a lot longer. I'm sure a lot of you know Alice well, but by way of introduction, Dr. Alice Jill Edwards is the 7th UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, the first woman to hold that role, and has been in post since August 2022. She's a renowned human rights lawyer and academic, dedicated her career to protecting victims of human rights violations all over the world, but in her early career, particularly in conflict zones like Bosnia and Herzegovina, Rwanda, and Mozambique. She's been instrumental throughout her career in advancing global recognition of rape and sexual violence as forms of torture. And one of the themes that we're going to keep emphasizing is that this report has not come from nowhere. This is something that builds on all the work that Alice has been doing throughout her career. The report itself, titled, we've got the details in the chat, and a link for you to go and get the report that Grace has shared, called Prohibiting, Preventing and Responding to Sexual Torture in Armed Conflict. Dr. Edwards presented it to the UN General Assembly at the end of October, and it examines the systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon of war, highlighting profound physical, psychological, and social harm that's inflicted on survivors, their families, and communities. And at the heart of the report, and we're going to really dig into this, is a call to action for all states to adopt the torture framework to address crimes of sexual violence. So that's kind of the introduction. Alice, let's come to you. As I've noted already, you've been really focused on torture and sexual violence for much of your career. So this has been an area of interest for you for a long time. But why did you feel that the report had to be written now in 2024? And I think you're just on mute, Alice. So you have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Crispin. And let me just take a step back to also give my thanks to IRCT and the leadership of Lisa Henry, and for this series, Berta Soleil. It's really wonderful to see a report that one works so hard for and has had so many great contributions. Some people who are on this chat, I see familiar faces who attended the online consultation. Many people submitted written contributions also, and they are all now online, so we can consult them again when we need to, or if we feel like more needs to be said. But it was a very wonderful collaboration to bring this report to the fore. And as Crispin said, you know, it's really a culmination, for me at least on a personal level, of a whole range of work I've done over the years, both in a UN field capacity, at a headquarters capacity, in my academic roles. And I felt that as the first female special rapporteur on torture, you know, what are some of the things that I can contribute to this mandate? What are some of the gaps? We've had some reports in the past, but nothing so explicit as this report on this very important topic of torture of sexual nature. And then being in the post of Special Rapporteur on Torture, you know, I've received just over the past year allegations about sexual violence from 27 active or recent conflicts. So, you know, we've got a long way to go in terms of resolving this. And it seems to me that the torture framework, which we've all been using, but can be kind of more effectively used, I think, in this domain. I also visited Ukraine as the Special Rapporteur on torture, as one of the, it was my first country visit, and the reason for going there first was because this really, someone has their, yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. The visit to Ukraine, you know, was really important, that where there is prolific torture, that the Special Rapporteur on Torture turns up. And what was very interesting in Ukraine is the high number of cases of sexual torture against male detainees and male civilians. And we still had challenges around exposing sexual torture against females. But I think one of the things I'd like to do in this report is that, in fact, everybody is at risk of this type of violence. Women and girls still bear the great brunt of this. But if you look at Ukraine, 36% of the cases that are now being actioned by the prosecutor's office actually involve male forms of sexual torture. And part of the report is to really understand sexual torture in all its dimensions, not only what seems to often be the focus on rape, whereas in fact there are a lot of horrendous things that are going on, and also listening to survivors about what they say about what has happened to them, and not only being subjected to sexual torture, but also all kinds of other forms of torture. So trying not to make an artificial distinction about what is going on in the torture world, so that we are closer to being able to provide proper rehabilitation and fuller rehabilitation for people, but also that investigations and prosecutions take up and prosecute everything that has happened to that person, not just with an international focus on a certain violation. So they were kind of the motivations, Crispin, for putting this in a full report. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, great. And you touched upon in that lots of the issues that we're going to kind of go into in depth, especially kind of the diverse sort of aspect of diversity and also rehabilitation. But sort of before we go there, can we go back to this central call to action that you have in the report, and explain how this reframing, I guess, that you're calling for would happen under both international settings and domestic settings, and what that means?
Yeah, so I think it's important to say that this is not to displace the women, peace and agenda and security agenda. It's not to, you know, dismiss the strides that have been taken to have explicit crimes under the ICC statute, for example. But it is to ground what is happening into the reality, rather than as an isolated cases. And so the call for action has 6 prongs to it. I think we're going to go through some of those, Crispin. But, you know, there are, I think, really strong advantages on the torture framework that has been built up over all these years. And of course, at the pinnacle of that is that the prohibition on torture is absolutely prohibited. It's a jus cogens norm. It's an erga omnes norm, which means that when someone is violated in one part of the world, we are actually all violated as human beings. So and very few human rights norms have attained this status. there are only really a handful. So I really wanted to look and explore how we can take advantage of that. You know, the prohibition on torture means there are no immunities, no amnesties, no statutes of limitations, and also no limits on when someone can seek rehabilitation and support. And this is very different than when you think about prosecutions for sexual violence, where often at the domestic level, there will be limits, especially time limits on how quickly a survivor has to come forward and make the complaint. There may also be lesser penalties. So just from that very, point one in the sixth prong is about the legal framework being a stronger, more robust legal framework. And I know we're going to go through the other areas, but you will find all six, and I think we're going to go through them sequentially or roundabout. So I'll hand back over to you, Crispin.
And we can jump around as well, because I know that life doesn't always work in straight lines. Let's start with the most important people, with the survivors. I mean, what difference will this make to people who've been through these dreadful crimes?
Yeah, it's a really good question. What we know and what we hear from victims and survivors is how hard it is to speak out about what has happened to them. Sometimes that is because of the context that they're in, the ongoing armed conflict. It can be because of disbelief. It can be because of shame and stigma, and those very strong social constraints on being able to speak out and speak up, or even just to seek assistance and seek support for what has happened to them. And what I think happens when you start framing sexual crimes as crimes of torture is it removes that stigma. There are many things that go on when you interview people about what has happened to them, and we've got great interviewing techniques these days, but allowing people to talk about what has happened to them in their own narrative, in their own way. In fact, what you gather is a whole lot of different crimes. This is to be compared with if you go in with the purpose of how many people have been subjected to sexual violence. And we know human rights NGOs sometimes do this. We know that the ICC might do this. We know that national prosecutors might do this. And I think that's, in many contexts, that's an artificial distinction, because quite often sexual violence or sexual torture is the pinnacle of the torture. It's one of the aspects that's happened to them. And also, speaking to survivors, it may not even be the most grave that they've been subjected to. We shouldn't be substituting for victims and survivors. If a survivor has lost their husband, that may be the biggest trauma they actually suffer from, and they'll tell you that. They may have a disability caused by other parts of the torture that they have suffered. So in a way, it allows victims and survivors to speak about the narrative themselves within this safe frame of torture, because I don't know of circumstances where people are ashamed to be a victim of torture. Quite often they are recognized as the heroes of the piece. So, it has a liberating effect, I guess, and that's what I'm hearing from victims and survivors.
And practically, it also has a real impact around issues like consent as well, doesn't it?
Yes, consent is not part of the definition of torture. We don't ask torture survivors whether they consented to the beating, whether they consented to be waterboarded, whether they consented to be strung up from their legs or from their arm. We don't ask that question because it's irrelevant, because they are in a circumstance of coercion, of an unequal and asymmetric power relationship. So when we think about sexual torture within the context of torture, that issue of consent for me also should not be relevant. And that's why the full spectrum of what has happened to them becomes so important, because it's odd, isn't it, to say, oh, we won't ask you about whether you consented to being abducted and held in a basement, etc. But we're going to ask you, what about the sex that happened within that context? You see, it's kind of perverse. So I think, I think that'll take some getting used to for investigators and others to take that on board. We already have a judgment or two by the international tribunals and courts to say that the coercive environment implies that there's no consent, yet they're still asking questions of consent because they're prosecuting under the rape crime or the sexual assault crime. So I think there's still some work to do to see how those things fit together. But I think that should be freeing for investigators and prosecutors, as well as for the victims and survivors themselves.
And taking some of those themes, what you've talked around shame and shifting shame, also around consent, what are some of the lessons for states when they're looking at a kind of survivor-led perspective? And I'm thinking particularly, you had a really interesting study visit to northern Iraq earlier in the year in preparation for the report. What were some of the examples from there, and what can other places learn from their experiences?
Yes, I had this wonderful visit to northern Iraq, and with the Jian Foundation for Human Rights and the Coalition for Justice there. And one of the examples that came out of leadership in the Yazidi community was the leader speaking up and welcoming back the women into the community regardless of what had happened. Now, we need this in all communities, and we need, leaders of all types, political, military, social, community leaders to welcome people back. And I think being able to say we welcome back all our victims of torture, is a really strong thing. And you don't have to pinpoint who suffered which particular crimes collectively. They get to rebuild their lives without that risk of shame. I mean, I think we have to be realistic that shame and stigma are widespread in many communities. And sometimes, even if they aren't, the individual themselves may feel it or may be afraid of it. But giving language that a president can use, for example, who may not even want to focus on sexual aspects, right? But being able to, and for those survivors to know that they come within that framework, I think would be very, very powerful. And I also think, the shame, and we can never say it enough, the shame is on the perpetrators. That's what we want to hear leaders say. Of course, the leaders are often complicit in it, etc. But the shame really needs to shift to the perpetrators where it really lies. And the same with morality. The morality is not the morality of the victims and survivors. This is the morality of people perpetrating torture of any kind, but sexual torture in particular. So, repeating that over and over again in all different types of fora, I think is really important. It means the victims and survivors hear it, and they hear it multiple times. And then it may, also through the rehabilitation support they receive, they hear it. It's often quietly said, if we could say it louder and embrace everyone who has suffered these terrible atrocities during conflict, I think it will be, empowering. And actually, as Lisa mentioned, we've had 2 survivor hearings for what we call hearings for healing and justice, and they're saying it now, and they're saying it loudly, and they're feeling, emboldened to be able to say it. And I think, that's really, really powerful.
So it's really great that you've raised those hearings for healing. I want to really get into rehabilitation, but maybe since we've talked about those events at the IRCT and the OMCT and national partners, I saw CAPS Colombia are on the call. Other national partners have organized so far in South America and in Africa incredible events where you've spent a substantial amount of time hearing directly from survivors their experiences, and that's really kind of fed into the advocacy and policy making that guidance that you're giving states. Can you talk a little bit, especially drawing on those two events, about survivor involvement in policy making in this area, and why it's critical, what survivors can do, what organizations working with survivors can do to assist?
You know, I give credit to IRCT for approaching me at the very beginning stages of my mandate. And, you know, my first vision report says that I will put victims and survivors at the center of my mandate. Now, it seems that everybody says that, but what does that mean in actually doing it? You know, and I've been working for victims and survivors for 25 years, but it doesn't mean that I can replace their voices. So, you know, to listen to them speak about what has happened to them is the very elementary. But I think what also is required is not just kind of involvement or engagement, it's actually their leadership. And, you know, I stand behind them, not in front of them, but behind them. You know, I feel like, and I'll announce on this call, you know, for the next Human Rights Council in, not this year, the following year, I will be putting together a report on victims and survivor perspectives, and that hasn't been done before by a special rapporteur. The whole report dedicated to the views and experiences, but also their recommendations. What do they want to happen? And so, you know, it's also, you know, leadership. It's not only about being consulted, but those survivors have said they want to be co-designers. It's not a one-off thing, it's a continuous thing. And it was interesting, you know, in northern Iraq, there was a lot of consultation, but sometimes it's a tick box exercise. Although we consulted that group, but then the government makes other decisions in which they don't consult, which means they're not really partners. And I think, you know, survivors are just people in the community. Right? I mean, in the African event, we had a politician sitting opposite a woman that Lisa mentioned, who was a fishmonger at the local market. You know, all different types of people. In Latin America, we had a young photographer who was out taking photographs of a protest and was injured. Alongside a very seasoned political advocate. And then we had a builder who said, look, I'm not an advocate, but this happened to me and I don't want anyone else to go through this. So, you know, I think the way the different types of survivors were brought together was really, you know, a great way to essentially repeat that actually we're all human beings. And I think we do have to be careful about saying survivor this and survivor that, as though they're over there and I'm over here. But I think we're getting, you know, closer, that survivors are a wide variety of people who have come from very different backgrounds, and almost as though torture doesn't discriminate when it is used. Sometimes, obviously, it discriminates, but you know, it touches many, many people's lives.
Yeah.
So
okay.
yes.
Great. And so we're coming towards the end of our time. I want to ask you a final question, but I'm going to squeeze a penultimate question in, just because I think it's really important to. You've touched on this all through your answers, but if there's anything else you'd like to add about how the torture framework enhances the right to rehabilitation for survivors of sexual crimes?
Well, it's one of the few treaties, if the only one of the human rights treaties, that has an explicit right of survivors to rehabilitation and an enforceable right to compensation. Now, compensation isn't always what they're after, but they do have this right. So I think that makes the Convention Against Torture in particular, where that Article 14 is located, very powerful. And I should say now there are 175 states parties to the convention. So probably last time we all chatted, there's been one additional state party. And that convention has now surpassed the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights in terms of how many states have endorsed that. So I think, there's something to celebrate at least, but those provisions in it now apply to 175 states parties. And I'd also say, am I still online?
I think you're still online if you keep,
sorry, we just had a... I'd also say that because there are 175 states parties, that also evidences state practice. So, certainly the definition of torture and potentially some of the other articles are now customary international law, which means they'll apply to the other, for those that aren't lawyers, will also apply to the other non-states parties.
Thank you. And so just finally, you're very strong in your report, and you were extremely strong in the GA as well in telling states what they need to change and giving them a very clear call to action on using the torture framework when it comes to sexual crimes within conflicts. What about the people on this call? What's your call to action to everyone who's here?
Well, I know we have a mix of people, and I can see 115 participants. So that, is already a tremendous interest in this. I would, look at my call for action, see where your organization could engage with different elements of it potentially. I think if you are in the rehabilitation space, many of you are probably doing this anyway, but allowing people to speak fully about what has happened to them, and within that context, allowing the space to be able to also talk about the sexual forms of torture. If you're in the more human rights advocacy, investigation, prosecution side, it's the same idea, right? Proper interviewing techniques, including applying the Mendes principles on investigative interviewing, to allow victims and survivors to be in charge of their own narrative. And when this happens, there's growing evidence to show they're more likely to talk about sexual forms of torture. But if one is too focused on a certain form of torture, that one is perhaps a human rights advocacy organization wanting a report on a certain form, then the way one interviews, the way one kind of looks at torture more broadly is really important, because because it often means people won't speak up. And I think that's part of the reason why we have so few, only part of the problem, but so few women that speak up, or they speak up late, is because there does seem to be this fixation on it, or at least they may be scared that there's a fixation, or that they know that the people are there for a certain report on a certain topic. So kind of one has to give more time, I think, for people and for interviews, and be led by victims and survivors. And, there's so much action that, states can take. And just to end, Crispin, I was recently at in San Remo at the International Institute of Humanitarian Law for an ICRC event. It's their major event every year, a big round table, and I was able to present this report. This is a room full of 100 military officers, soldiers, attachés, etc. And I was asking all of them about, how does this happen? How does this still happen? It's not only happening in the war space, it's happening also within militaries. As a female soldier, you are also at heightened risk within the military. And I thought one statement by a very senior Norwegian military officer said, you know, I think what happens sometimes is soldiers have not internalized the values of human rights. So they hear it, they're trained on it, but actually they don't share the values. And so when they're in an environment in which they're in a coercive environment, they may be, there's a peer pressure, there's pressure to be quiet about violations as well, that they may not have actually internalized those human rights values. And so that was one interesting observation. And another, I think, in relation to that is we need to start training militaries about what to say when a colleague is engaging in conduct that is prohibited. You know, having the frame in which they say, you have to stop, this is not permitted. And also, there should be promotions for people that expose these kind of violations, rather than what often happens is they're sidelined, etc. So I think, although this report, was about war, it's specifically about wartime, so soldiers are very relevant, there wasn't as much in it. There was some zero tolerance and don't recruit people with, criminal backgrounds, etc. But I think perhaps that's part that could be expanded about how to do this better. And there is some research in, gang violence, gang related in peacetime, that we could be looking at to see, what is happening in wartime to allow essentially, collective bad behavior. We keep saying, as human rights people, oh, we need, it's a lack of impunity, it's impunity and these kind of things. But what does it mean concretely down for that soldier on the day when they hear, names being called of someone on the other side, and that they have a free rein to, to take their possessions and to violate and break down their door, etc., etc. I think we need to kind of have a better alignment between, what militaries are mandated to do and who is in the military and what values they have and how they can assert their values in complex situations.
Thank you so much, Alice. I'm going to ask you to leave it there so I can hand over to Bertha, because we've got so many people and we'll have lots and lots of questions coming up. So thank you.
Thank you, Crispin.
Thank you so much, Crispin and Alice, for this very insightful conversation around the main topics that the report covers, which I am sure have generated a lot of reflection and questions, and that's why we will now open the floor to the audience for questions, again, reflections, comments, and to do that, I will kindly ask you or encourage you to raise your hand. I will have a list with the names in line, and I will ask you to unmute to pose your question every time. I will also try to be aware of the questions that come in the chat, but I'd ask you to please prioritize to go on mic to the extent possible. And we have someone sharing screen, which we're gonna unshare now. Good. Okay, so with that, anyone who wants to ask a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and I will put the gallery view here. If there are any questions or reflections, and I can see CAPS Colombia are saying that it will be important to present the report in Colombia in 2025. Lisa and Alexis, you have your hand up, and Vanessa, so I'll take Lisa first, then Alexis, and then Vanessa.
Thank you, Bertha. And thanks a lot, both Crispin and Alice, for expanding on this. Having just come from a trip to Nigeria and celebrating together with Prawa, one of the IRCT members there, 30th anniversary, and an organization in Nigeria spending significant time on exactly one of the pieces you talked about, Alice. You know, it's a training of the police and a training of the staff and the correction facilities there. And yet a repetition of some of these crimes. And so I guess my question to you is, you know, as we look toward the future and as we look at, you know, limited resources, but then we have a reach, where is it in the hierarchy of the training system? I guess we had the police chief there, or I mean the head of the police, and then the correctional facility saying everything's fine, and of course we train all the time on human rights and everybody should know it. But from that to what goes on the ground, totally different. And so I think some of your ideas, this thing of, you know, celebrating those who take a stand, and are there other techniques, Alice, that you think would be relevant with respect to, you know, this gap that I think civil society organizations often find themselves in? They can be a trusted partner sometimes of, you know, judges or of some of the people in the correctional facilities or the police or the, you know, the judicial arm, but you know, where's the place where's the level where we're really going to make the impact that counts? Thanks.
Berta, do you want me to respond immediately? Yes?
I think so, yeah.
Okay,
Let's do it
great.
like that, because there's going to be a lot of questions.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, for starting us off. You know, whether it's sexual torture or torture, we have a lot of work to do in changing mindsets, which is what we always say about cultural shifting, cultural shifts. And one of the you know, bugbears, I guess, for me, or one of the problems I've always had with how we operate as an international community, is the constant training that we do, but almost without consequences. So training without qualifications, training without testing, training without graduation, training without integrating it within an academy, but kind of separate training. So I think that we still see a lot, these kind of more, you know, ad hoc trainings that happen. And I think whenever we can, we should be going through academies and strengthening those academies. And certain roles, especially in the police, require specialist expertise. And so kind of trying to get countries to move towards a more professionalized structure. Not everybody should be interviewing, not everybody should be interviewing children, not everybody should be interviewing victims versus suspects, etc. So I think that is definitely part of it. And then, you know, recruitment is a really important part that I think we haven't spent enough time on at the international, you know, as a collective international community, all of us together. I do know CTI, I had wanted when I was at the head of CTI, one of the tools to be on recruitment, because for this report, it says clearly anyone that has a background in domestic violence or sexual violence, you know, a criminal background should be excluded from recruitment into militaries. Of course, what we see is that the recruitment is direct from prison. So, you know, in some places, so it's there are lots of problems still, but I think, you know, and there are a lot of places where, you know, the police over time and the military, you know, especially if the country is in an armed conflict, or where there's, you know, high levels of crime or terrorism, etc. These roles are very, you know, they're demanding on people, and you know, there's enough research on some police forces where domestic violence by police officers against their own families is heightened because of the type of job that they are doing. And, you know, that needs to be, you know, there've been a lot of improvements in terms of counselling for police officers, etc. Yeah, but I think on those two fronts, training, more professionalized training, and clearer, maybe even, you know, some good guidance on what recruitment and promotion systems look like, so we don't incentivize, you you know, we don't have poor recruitment practices, we get the wrong people in, but also we don't promote people that shouldn't be promoted, and then they continue on. Sometimes, and I know we've got a lot of questions, but sometimes it does take a full-scale clearing out of the police force, you know, in context of corruption, etc. And leaders need to be really brave to be able to do that. That happened in the Australian New South Wales Police Force when I was going through university and attended the Royal Commission, that they said there was widespread corruption from the commissioner himself down to the newest recruit, and they started to disband the entire police force and put in new procedures, etc. So I think, and you know, you might need to do that with the full military as well, you know. So I think there are there's more research there that I think we need to get our hands on and understand, so we can provide better advice when requested or when we see an issue.
Thanks.
Thank you, Alice and Lisa. So a lot of issues on training, recruitment, and promotion. I have now on my list Alexis and then Vanessa. Alexis, make sure to unmute, and for the others, make sure you're on the English channel
Oui,
now.
bonjour, vous m'entendez?
Bonjour Alexis, on t'écoute.
Vous m'entendez?
Oui, oui.
OK. Je remercie de m'avoir accordé la parole. J'ai très bien suivi l'exposé de l'avocate Alice. Ça m'amène à poser une telle question. Et nous, au niveau de la RDC, vous voyez que c'est un pays... c'est un pays avec beaucoup de problèmes, avec beaucoup d'injustices. L'appareil judiciaire même ne fonctionne pas comme il fallait. Alors, nous, en tant qu'organisation de défense des droits de l'homme sur le terrain, nous avons un problème, c'est-à-dire qu'on n'a pas accès d'entrer dans certaines prisons, dans certains cachots, parce que c'est dans ces cachots-là où il y a beaucoup de tortures sexuelles et beaucoup de pédophilie qui se font. Maintenant, je voulais demander, est-ce que les Nations Unies ou la rapporteuse des Nations Unies peut nous donner une stratégie à pouvoir arriver à convaincre les autorités sur place afin qu'ils autorisent à pouvoir accéder au cachot? Ça, c'était la première question. Parce que là où il y a beaucoup de violences sexuelles qui se passent ou la torture sexuelle, il y a beaucoup de pédophilie qui se passe et d'autres actes inhumains et dégradants. Et deuxième question, est-ce que les rapports pareils qui vient d'être publié par la rapporteuse spéciale des Nations Unies, est-ce que ces rapports sont envoyés vers les pays qui font ces actes de torture avec intégralité? Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas de censure qui se réalise avant que ces rapports n'arrivent aux pays qui font ces actes de torture? Troisième question, Alice a fait l'exposé, elle a parlé de prison, elle a parlé aussi de situations judiciaires. Je sais que pour mettre fin à toutes ces tortures sexuelles, on doit passer par la justice. Mais je n'ai pas entendu là où elle a parlé de la protection des témoins. Parce qu'il y a de ces témoins-là qui ont peur. Quand elle va venir témoigner devant la justice, les tortionnaires vont les poursuivre. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a représailles. Maintenant, est-ce qu'il y a des mécanismes qui sont faits pour la protection des témoins en cas de justice? Merci.
Alice, you got the translation?
Yes, merci Alexis. I'll speak in English. On your first, yes, access is a real issue. If you don't have access, one of the things I would encourage you to do is to speak to your parliamentarians, because the idea, you know, regardless of kind of what your legal system looks like, the parliamentarians should be able to access prisons. They may not even know that they have the right to access prisons. They are the eyes for the public. They are there in Parliament to represent the public. So you might be able to find some compassionate parliamentarians who want to take up this issue of access. First, access for themselves. I'm sure as soon as they have access for themselves, they will be advocating for ratification of the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture and creating parliamentary visiting committees. Other countries have judicial and prosecutors that are required to visit the prisons. So have a look and see if there's anything in your system that already provides for this, but perhaps is not being exercised at all. And the other, of course, you know, the International Committee of the Red Cross may, and usually, and I know in the DRC does have access to places of detention. It may be that you need to be informing them of the places that they should be going. Perhaps they haven't got access, you know, they haven't got the eyes and ears everywhere. So I would suggest those two things. Your question on the reports. So these reports are shared with all of the UN member states. In advance of publication, the parts that refer to them are actually shared in advance. And then it is up to me whether I take any views they have on board. So that is kind of the process. This year, my team in Geneva had to send 110 letters. 110 countries were named in my report to the General Assembly. I actually think that is a very good practice because A, they get to see bits beforehand, so they get engaged. It worked very well for my prisons report, where many then decided they went back to their countries and wanted more information and to make some changes. So it becomes a dialogue. Very few write asking for things to change. In the last report, a couple did, but not related to the sexual torture part. So they are all shared with that report, and then they discuss it at either this report was discussed at the General Assembly, and other report that I write are discussed to the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So there's each of the report is presented and they get to be on the record on that. I think you make a very good third point about the protection of witnesses, and also, of course, the protection of victims who are also witnesses. There is a protection in the Convention Against Torture. It's explicit. That says that not only should there be complaints procedures, but people need to be protected. I think it is an underexplored way of how to protect people properly. I did address it in my report. I think it's IRCT 55/52 on the obligation to investigate and prosecute crimes of torture. So there is, I did present last year a more general report on investigations and prosecutions, and in a way this report on sexual torture is the continuation of that, and they should be read together. So there are some state practices around victim and witness protection, because as you say, it is key. But I think we could actually collect more of how to do this more effectively. And yeah, I mean, some countries are great, you know, they will assign a liaison officer to every victim of any crime, right? But of course, the most important thing with torture, when it's mostly perpetrated by public officials, is that the investigation body is separate from the police. So I'm really advocating for these independent investigators, so they stand alone and they should be subject to less intimidation and therefore have their own way to protect victims and witnesses, so that they are not intimidated within the police or by other actors. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Alice.
Yeah,
thank you so much. I will go now to Vanessa, and then afterwards we have Kanayo. Can get ready. Vanessa from Nigeria.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. My name is Vanessa Dixon, and I work with Legend Golden Care Foundation in Nigeria. I would just like to state that we are members of the IRCT in Nigeria, and we work with torture victims as well. I have two questions to ask. The first one would be, Given the mention of the protests being politicized with excessive force and violence globally in the reports, and considering the recent protests in Nigeria, how can Nigeria ensure that law enforcement agencies manage peaceful protests in compliance with international human rights standards? And I would just like to also state that after the recent protest that was held in Nigeria, some persons who participated in the protest were wrongfully arrested and detained, and Legend Golden Care Foundation has been actively monitoring court sittings for these persons and ensuring that their rights are not being violated during court proceedings. We've also been providing rehabilitation services for these victims. So I would like to know how, maybe subsequently, how Nigeria law enforcement agencies can manage peaceful protests to ensure that they're in compliance with international human rights standards. And my second question would be, given the challenges in gathering evidence in conflict settings, how can Nigeria strengthen its investigative and prosecutorial capacity to ensure perpetrators of sexual torture are held accountable? Thank you.
Many thanks, Vanessa, for these very good questions. The question of protests and managing protests, we do have now quite a range of guides. The Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and Association published a good practice guide at the end of last year, which does intersect and mentions torture on a number of occasions. I think you're right to mention the fact that there's violence within there may be violence and excessive force within the protest, but then often people are being taken off to detention, and then different violence is being inflicted at that stage. So I'd refer you to those guidelines, but also my own work and those of others on, the first thing is to make sure that the weapons that are being used are appropriate. And last year I published a list of 20 weapons, restraints and equipment that I consider are prohibited by the torture prohibition. And I'm asking states to do a stock take of their weapons caches that the police and security forces are using, and that they are removing any offending items from their lists. And a lot of NGOs are now also supporting my call for a torture-free trade treaty, which others have worked on also. So maybe, reaching, for the government to actually engage in that process. Sometimes if you give countries a leadership role, they actually do change because they want to be seen to be doing a great thing. So perhaps Nigeria, and we can get you some more information on this if you like. Maybe they want to join the Global Alliance, which is a state-led alliance, and then you give them kind of a platform, and then they conform because they then become a leader in that space. You asked then second about investigation and prosecution. I think, I would refer you to my report that I published prior to this one, which is on the duty to investigate and prosecute. There are a lot of good examples from other countries in there about how they're doing it. But, number one is that there's a clear crime of torture, and a distinct, impartial investigative body. This is what is different about the crime of torture compared to common crimes, is that it's been committed by the very authorities that are there to protect the citizens. So if they're investigating themselves, this is where it all breaks down, as you know. So really kind of moving them to a different type of model. And also I'd say while they're in the phase of not yet at that separate model, interviewing techniques is absolutely key. And, working with the Mendes protocol on investigative interviewing, which moves from kind of aggressive, coercive forcing a confession, to rapport building, human rights respecting interviewing. And there's a lot of very good scientific research, including of persons convicted of very serious crimes, about their level of willingness to cooperate with the police, but they decide not to when they're treated badly. We can all understand that, right? I think we can all understand that as human beings. Someone is, aggressive towards you, I'm not cooperating with them. So this is a new way, and there's a lot of work by APT, the Association for the Prevention of Torture, and others in trying to roll, and the Norwegian Centre for Human Rights and others, to try and roll this out and to get governments and police authorities to take it on board. I have to say, the interviewing techniques are not, it's not rocket science. It's not that dissimilar to what's proposed in the Istanbul Protocol. We're talking about letting people speak. We're talking about giving them the opportunity to, talk and to share their story without intimidation and coercion and all those things. So, but it's a more structured format to keep police and other investigators in line when they are conducting those interviews.
Thank you, Alice. Thank you so much. I will just remind everyone that Laura Blanco shared in the chat the CTI Police Resource Toolkit, the chapter on investigating sexual crimes. It's in the chat, maybe more related to the question before. But yeah, and now I will move on to Canayo. I think I can see she's ready. And then afterwards, I'll take Ahmed and then Grant.
All right, thank you very much, Alice. I would first of all like to really commend you for the amazing work you're doing. It's always very heartening when we see people who are working for people that are essentially voiceless. Now, my question is, you talked about 175 state parties to the convention. And to be honest, I must say that for a lot of states, it's a box-ticking exercise. And why do I say that? States would ratify the CAT, they would ratify the OPCAT, but they would do nothing about the obligation to these conventions. And essentially the same way you talked about training without consequences, what it is being members or being parties to these conventions without consequences. Isn't there a way that the international community can come up with some measure of consequences? Because I think that the reason torture is festering at the level, we're probably never going to see a world without torture. But when it does happen, what do we do? And the reason that torture is festering in a lot of countries is because there's really no consequence. People know that they can get away with it. The state turns the other, they look away from it. So is there a way, my question is there a way we can actually sanction states? I don't know if we'd even come to a point of striking them off. If you just ratify this protocol without actually adhering to the obligations that come with it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Canayo. It's a really meaty question. It is true that some states ratify treaties in order to have international praise, but then do very little about it. I always found it disheartening that, in fact, there are more dictatorships than democracies that have ratified, not more. There are more democracies that haven't ratified the convention than dictatorships. So of the remaining countries, the large majority are actually democracies that haven't taken that step. And there are some reasons for it, because many of them are small island developing states. But I do think there are two levels here, I would say. The first is, there is a reporting process to the Committee Against Torture. And okay, some countries haven't ever turned up. But if they do, this does open a dialogue, and it is an important dialogue. They are required to report, and as civil society actors, one can kind of point where actually the information isn't correct and also furnish information to the committee. There's also the Universal Periodic Review, which every single country in the world, and we're in the 4th cycle, has reported, in which states can hold other states to account. And I think what civil society can do can be to contact other states to get them to ask the questions that we want asked. And with the Universal Periodic Review, the last time I checked, and since Laura Blanco was just in the chat, maybe she knows the statistics if they're still the same, but of the top 5 recommendations from all of the 195 states being reviewed, 2 related to torture. One was ratifying the convention, and the other was about specific torture-related questions. So it is high on people's agenda. And then the second level is really about domestic implementation and what you can do at a domestic level. And there are consequences. And I think, you know, being vigilant at monitoring, at raising cases, at helping people put in complaints, in writing reports, in taking them to Parliament, getting parliamentarians on board, can all help. You know, these things don't change overnight, and there will always be incidents, but what we want is that they become incidents, they become isolated, and we can say that that was an isolated incident. At the moment, too many countries are it's quite routine, it's even some are, it's systemic, it's normalized, etc. We need to get more countries in the list where, yes, there might be a case of torture, but it was from some officer who overstepped their authority, and it's not an endemic problem. I think that's what I'd say on that, knowing that we've got other questions. But thanks so much.
Thank you, Alice. And I know it's hard. You would go on and on with answering to these questions, but yeah, we have Ahmed next, and then Grant, and I will encourage everyone to, like, if there are any more questions, to rather put them in the chat, because in a couple of, in 3 to 4 minutes, we will be closing the Q&A session. But Ahmed, if you want to go ahead, and maybe you can introduce yourself so we know.
Okay. Merci beaucoup. Je suis Ahmed Benasser, je suis médecin légiste, je suis enseignant à la faculté de médecine de Tunis et je préside l'Institut Nebras, qui est un institut de réhabilitation de survivants de torture. Alors, mon intervention, tout d'abord, je vous remercie pour cette opportunité, mais mon intervention se focalisera surtout sur la documentation médico-légale. Alors, juste pour vous dire que la documentation médico-légale de la torture sexuelle reste le parent pauvre de la documentation. Et d'ailleurs, quand on revoit les rapports médico-légaux, quand on revoit les curriculums de formation, on s'aperçoit que c'est une partie assez négligée. Et d'ailleurs, les médecins et les avocats qui travaillent dessus ne comprennent pas forcément la philosophie même de la torture sexuelle, puisque parfois ils la mettent sous une même case alors qu'on ne parle pas d'une seule forme de torture sexuelle. Elle est tellement polymorphe, elle est tellement différente d'un contexte à un autre. Moi, j'ai eu une petite expérience de documentation aussi bien dans le contexte libyen, irakien, syrien, c'est tout à fait différent. Alors, c'est vrai que ça touche les hommes, aussi bien les hommes que les femmes. Ça touche énormément les enfants. Et c'est pour cela que je vais peut-être inviter à tout d'abord harmoniser les curriculums de formation. Certes, il y a l'Istanbul Protocol, mais il faudrait harmoniser les curriculums de formation dans les pays et s'adresser, je vais dire, à la bonne audience. Parce que, certes, former la société civile, c'est bien, mais parfois, je vais dire, ces participants n'ont pas toujours, je vais dire, le background nécessaire en matière de documentation médico-légale. Et là, j'adhère à ce que vient de dire Alice. Par exemple, de bonnes pratiques en Tunisie, la documentation médico-légale de la torture figure dans le curriculum de 5e année de médecine de la faculté de médecine de Tunis. On a un masterclass de documentation médico-légale à la faculté de médecine de Tunis qui est ouvert aux urgentistes et aux médecins de première ligne avec l'appui de Dignity. Deuxièmement, une autre bonne pratique qui est le curriculum de formation documentation de la torture et violence sexuelle étaient toujours associées dans les programmes de PHR en Irak, parce qu'avant, on formait seulement soit sur torture, soit violence sexuelle. Et enfin, pour ne pas accaparer la parole, j'insiste sur le domaine de la réhabilitation qui aide la documentation. Parce que l'exemple de Nebraska où on a eu à prendre des victimes de torture sexuelle dans le contexte libyen, on s'aperçoit que ces victimes et ces survivants ne parlent pas de torture sexuelle. Mais après, je vais dire, une période de réhabilitation où ces personnes gagnent confiance, ils peuvent parler. Et d'ailleurs, avec des techniques simples telles que la narrative exposure therapy, on a des personnes qui parlent, qui ont leur narration, et cette narration est d'un appui très, très fort d'un point de vue documentation médico-légale. Donc, une harmonisation des cursus académiques et bien sûr, je vais dire, la réhabilitation peut aider énormément lors de la documentation médico-légale de la torture.
Thank you so much, Ahmed. I fully endorse what you have said. For my country visits, I also travel. I am an international lawyer, so I also travel with a forensic expert. And I think this, the ability for the Istanbul Protocol to infiltrate the state medico-legal services, but also I totally take the point that rehabilitation and providing people with support can help the disclosure of information. It improves the documentation, and added to that, they also become much better victims and witnesses in court because they've been guided along that process by professionals. So thank you for your comment on that.
Thank you, Alice and Ahmed, and good to meet you, Ahmed. And next is Grant. And Grant, I will kindly ask you if you can switch on your camera, if it's possible at all.
Of course, I would very much like to switch on my camera, but I am working from a very old computer that sometimes has a mind of its own and prevents me from doing so. So I apologize for that, and I wish I could join you all on camera.
We'll imagine you.
Yeah, please do. Well, but and thank you to you, and thank you for Dr. Edwards for your extremely enlightening and important report, and also to IRCT for this series of events. Dr. Edwards, I wanted to ask about any observations or conclusions you may have made in going about the research and the accumulation for this report, particularly about where gender norms interact with the perpetration and response to torture generally, and also obviously to sexual torture. Part of the reason I ask is because at Dignity, which I should mention, I'm a legal advisor at Dignity. Dignity, we see that torture often takes the shape of the prevailing gender norms and structures of powers. And we see that at times, women, men, LGBT persons are all subject to perhaps the same act of sexual torture, but the purpose behind that torture is different. So women maybe experience the same act of sexual torture in a different way, or for a different underlying purpose than men, which is also different than maybe members of the LGBT community. But we also see at other times, men and women, members of the LGBT community, are subject to different types of torture or sexual torture. And for example, in Palestine, we see that in the ongoing atrocities occurring in Palestine, men, for example, are subjected to public nudity as humiliation, to strip them of their status as the occupiers of social status, of leaders, of holding the preponderance of political power, whereas women are sexualized. They're targeted as being sexual beings. They're targeted in their sexuality. And that distinction strikes us as an important one in the motivation, the prohibited purpose behind perpetrators' actions, and also the intention behind the infliction of severe suffering. So I thought, you must have come across certain of those patterns, and thought maybe you could just speak a little bit to the gendered patterns there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Grant. I mean, this is a thought-provoking question. It takes me back to my PhD research. And actually, I concluded in my book, Violence Against Women Under International Human Rights Law, that we should, yes, there are people come with different social and economic and religious, even ethnic backgrounds, but that we should really be treating people as individuals and really hearing what they're saying is happening about them. So, I think there's a fine line between finding these so-called gender norms and stereotyping. Finding gender norms legitimate, stereotyping not so legitimate, and leads us to kind of trying to categorize people when actually people may not want to be categorized. For the purpose of the torture definition, of course, there is this requirement to establish a purpose for the torture. I'm actually of the view that the Article 1 Convention Against Torture definition is a description of what the drafters wanted to address at the time of drafting the convention. It's now turned into the kind of the legal requirements, but actually it was a description of a phenomenon from Latin America in the 70s and 80s. And in there are several purposes for which torture would be perpetrated, including discrimination. But it's an open-ended list, which means it's not limited to those purposes. And the other strange thing about the purposes is that some are benign and some are malignant. So some are ordinary functions, like trying to extract information or a confession. You just can't inflict serious harm for that purpose. But the purpose itself is an ordinary law enforcement purpose. And then some are actually always egregious, like oppression and intimidation and discrimination. So I put that there because when we search for, the reasons of why certain torture is being perpetrated, I think there are more similarities than there are perhaps differences. And we can have an academic exercise about, was it the upturning of gender norms, why men were subjected to, rape, or is that even needed? What's the purpose of doing that? Is it to identify how we could prevent this in the future? Is it just to understand what's going on from a epistemological or other kind of perspective, or is it to satisfy the torture definition? So I think there are different reasons for unpacking that, but and different perpetrators will have different motivations, and different victims and survivors will feel these things differently about why it happened to them. But they're not the only, in that circumstance alone, the victim and survivor may not have a full grip on why it happened to them. Neither may the perpetrator, because they may be in amongst everybody else doing the exact same things, and they may not even know that they're part of a genocide. They just thought they were, that this was standard military practice, for example. So I think there's a lot more to kind of unpack, and I think we should always ask ourselves why we're asking the question, and from what perspective, when we're talking about gender norms, because there are enough examples that I have that throw up and question the normative part of the gender norm thing. There are enough female soldiers now who've been raped. There, females are becoming soldiers. Females have been involved as perpetrators in some of the worst forms. Abu Ghraib, for example, as just one example, in Iraq with the US forces. So, sometimes, and that's, sometimes I worry that we try and find a pattern when perhaps the pattern doesn't exist, or there are enough examples to say that we need to be careful in applying these ideas of gender norms, or inferring onto perpetrators why they're doing something when actually they may have a totally different reason for doing it, may be totally ethnic, may have nothing to do with gender. So, I think there's a lot to unpack, and I guess I'm over all of these years, I think now I'm at a point where I'm uncomfortable with these attempts, and hence also using the torture framework. And why I've promoted it is because it's inclusive. It's not saying, oh, women and girls are subjected to rape and men aren't, and therefore men can be subjected to torture, but women, we put them over here under the sexual violence category. But in fact, there are, you know, all different reasons why things are happening. And often they are about ethnicity, race, religion, in which there are targets that also have a gender dimension to them, right? Of course. But yes, I guess Grant, I think more needs to be unpacked, and we really shouldn't generalize, just as we try not to generalize across victims and survivors. I think we shouldn't generalize across gender norms.
Yeah. Thank you, Alice. Yeah, that's a complex question. I can see also in the chat message she's commenting, the purpose in my eyes is humiliation and deterrence. Marianne, maximum humiliation, but a variety of approaches depending on the individual. Yeah, I think if there are no further questions, well, Asger has had his hand up. Now it's lowered, so that means he doesn't have any comment so far. Okay. So yeah, I will thank Alice and all of you.
Linda seems to have a question about Linda McDonald, if there's time.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm sorry I couldn't figure out how to get my hand up.
Okay, sorry.
I'm just wondering, Alice, to expand on what you're saying about the separation between men and women and sexual violence, where you stand around the difference between non-state actors torture and state torture between women and men, of course, as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Linda. You know, I think the Committee Against Torture has said that, you know, where the state is failing in its essentially due diligence obligations, and the Human Rights Committee takes the same view, that the torture framework still applies to non-state torture. So that's also my approach. I think that's the right one. Of course, it's even stronger in relation to international humanitarian law, so within the context of wartime. You know, in that context, non-state actors are not spared from responsibility and liability, etc. So there, you know, I think the framework is stronger, and you know, torture being perpetrated by non-state actors, whether they're rebel groups, terrorist groups, de facto authorities, we should be holding them all accountable. What I would say in terms of how the legal framework should apply to that, you know, I think countries should create legal frameworks that are suitable to their own context. So a lot of Latin American countries now have different forms of torture, or they may have higher penalties if it's a state authority, because of this idea that they have a heightened responsibility or duty of care compared to non-state actors. And here the big focus on gangs and maras, etc. From a victim perspective, perhaps that's not so satisfactory. If you're a victim of a gang violence, gang torture versus government torture, or terrorist torture versus government torture. So I think that is an area where one can have separate crimes or different penalties, higher penalties for the state, and that can be worked out in that way. But certainly we should be holding, you know, perpetrators to account. I think where it goes into the full violence against women context, I mean, the torture framework also applies. It's not what I was focusing on in this report, because it was more wartime torture, and therefore more having a state or non-state actor element to it. But yes, I mean, the committee is quite clear that private acts of violence, if the state does not step in, can also fall within the torture framework. And so does the European Court on Human Rights and the African Court, etc.
We can hear they're calling you. So with that, we unfortunately will have to leave it here. I know, Shirley, you have a hand up. Feel free to write it in the chat and maybe we can address it later, but we have to close in time, on good time. And while we do that, I will kindly ask Andrea, good, she has already pulled the survey out. So if you can kindly respond to those 3 questions. And I will thank so much, thanks to all of you so much for your time, and especially Alice and Crispin for prioritizing this and for taking us through this very insightful journey around the many aspects, let's say, surrounding the topic and the report. Lisa, do you want to have some closing remarks, or Merry Christmas?
I think we say thank you very much. It's been a long journey. It's been a great series for all of you who've spent time, and especially for all the survivors who were listened to and who have co-designed, I believe, the way this series has turned out. We're committed to keeping on this pathway and improving services through all these great lessons learned. And we will use and refer to consistently this report, Alice. This really gives us, something, and I think it's an incredibly important. Take the time to read it, share it with your staff. It has incredibly useful details. It's so rich in detail and it's so accessible. I mean, it's useful. So unlike no comment on other UN reports right there, but this one is very much useful. So thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, we have our work cut out for us, no doubt, into the new year 2025. Thank you very much, and we'll see you on the other side.
Thank you so much. And as Lisa said, we will also be following up in 2025 on how these spaces were useful to help you improve the work with cases of sexual torture, and how can we keep moving on that direction. Yes, but for now, thank you all. And as Lisa said, Merry Christmas to all of you. We
Thank you.
wish you a good time with family and your loved ones. Many presents.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.